Chapter 1. Love and an Evangelized Intellect by Atessa Afshar. Iran, land of Cyrus and Darius and Esther and the Ayatollah, land also of my birth. The year I was born, C.S. Lewis died, but I would have cared nothing for that then. It was the last decade of the Shah's reign. Under his influence, Tehran had grown explosively, owing its identity too much to Western ways to be truly Middle Eastern. But Iranian history and tradition lingered in every corner, so it couldn't be truly Western either. I was born in a nominally Muslim family. Nominal Muslims differ little from nominal Christians. My parents believed in being generally conscientious. They were only tell white lies, law-abiding citizens. However, they did not adhere to even the most basic tenets of Islam. My mother would not be caught dead wearing the hijab, the traditional Muslim covering for women, outside of special religious occasions. She was an extremely fashionable woman, as were most of her friends. My mother was a true Tehrani, as comfortable sitting in her yellow Camaro as she was cross-legged on the floor, quoting Omar Khayyam. My father, a Paris-educated radiologist, was a general in the army of the Shah, though I think of him more as a physician than a military man. We never could figure out how he came by the row of medals on his dress uniform. Although by no means a religious man, he respected spiritual things in his own way. The few deep conversations I recall having with my father stick in my mind like superglue, such as when he told me to give God his due respect. My parents had rejected much of Islam, but not the notion of a loving God. Like Christians, Muslims believe that God is loving and compassionate, but they have no proof of that claim, no manger and no cross to back up their beliefs. As proudly educated Tehranis, they had abandoned the more quaint points of religion long ago. Devils and angels and miracles were the domain of the ignorant. I mostly learned about Islam and its tenets from my grandmother, a devout Muslim. She prayed at least 5 times a day, fasted 1 month out of the year, made the pilgrimage to Mecca, wore the hijab, paid her tithe, and followed Muhammad's teachings with all her might. But her belief did not seem to have the intellectual depth to satisfy my questions. Once I asked my grandmother, if God had created space itself, then where was he before space was there? "Never ask that question or any like it," my grandmother admonished. "Such questions are sinful." I thought, if God is that oversensitive, I'm not sure we'll get along. I needed a God who could withstand my questions and more. There was no C.S. Lewis in my world to answer the challenges of my mind. Not until years later would Lewis's writings teach me that to love God does not require you to get an annulment from your brain. Lewis would one day teach me that God isn't afraid of our challenges. He questioned God with more ruthless vigor than anything my mind could summon, yet he came away increased in his faith. When I was almost 14 years old, about a year before the Islamic Revolution, my parents divorced and my mother decided to leave Iran and settle in Europe with my sister and me. Little did we know that when we moved to Cambridge, England, that Iran would never again be our home. Cambridge, coincidentally, was Lewis's last academic home. I must have walked by Lewis's college many times, never knowing that it once housed a genius and a man of faith who one day would aid my own journey to God. Moving to a different country is always jarring. Different food, different customs, and a different language can all become overwhelming. I remember one of the first things that took getting used to was the cemeteries. I had never seen a cemetery as a child growing up in Iran. Death is not a thing you stare at in the Middle East. People rarely make a will because it makes death seem too uncomfortably close. One never speaks of the death of someone still living, not even under the most pragmatic or respectful of contexts. Cemeteries are built in out-of-the-way places where you aren't likely to happen upon one by chance. As a child, I never wore black or visited the graveside of dead relatives and friends. I think this avoidance of death comes from the fact that Islam offers very few eternal guarantees. One enters paradise by the merit of one's actions and obedience to Allah. Because there is no notion of grace, of sins covered by God's own sacrificial death, human death remains the unconquered enemy no one likes to be reminded of. Funerals are emotional trials. The loss seems so great that one can receive almost no comfort. Conversely, Christ conquered death. It has no sting. Years later, when I first read the Narnia Chronicles and found that the children died in a train crash, I did not even feel sad. Before Lewis, reading a book about likable teenagers who die in the end would have brought me to fears and tears. But in Narnia, Lewis made the afterlife so real and natural that death lost its clammy hold of fear upon me. Why be sad when they were with Aslan? In England, I began to attend a girls' boarding school called Princess Helena College. There I went to church for the first time, for weekly church attendance is part of English heritage. I didn't get much out of those Sunday pilgrimages, and it was probably mostly my own fault. The few foreign girls who attended the school were told to sit upstairs and read their own holy books. I read romance novels, so while I learned some things about love, it wasn't exactly what Jesus had in mind. Eventually, I moved to the States to go to college, and this has been my home since. It still shocks me, however, that having lived in the Christian West most of my adult life, I never heard the gospel until I was 26 years old. Perhaps people did not want to intrude or offend. Perhaps they just did not know how to approach me. Finally, I think God decided He had had enough. If Christians were not going to approach me, then He would have to do it directly. During a particularly difficult time in my life, I had a dream that as I stood by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus Himself walked toward me. Having never read the Bible, my only real knowledge of Jesus had been through films I had seen as a schoolgirl. Perhaps you know the ones I mean, the ones in which Jesus was blonde, blue-eyed, and very handsome in a movie star kind of way. None of this was true of the Jesus in my dream. Frankly, He appeared quite homely to me. Not until later did I read in Isaiah that the Messiah would not be much to look at. My first reaction was disappointment. This was Jesus? Perhaps the most miraculous part of this dream, however, apart from the fact that Jesus asked me to follow Him and I did, was that I knew who He was. I was aware of the fullness of His identity. I knew that this man was the Son of God of very God, and to be trusted above all. The dream did not make me a Christian, but it did give me 3 days of unshakable peace, a very precious commodity at that time in my life. And it also laid a foundation for what followed. Within months of my dream, Christians finally began to share the message of salvation with me. In the Bible, I came across a passage that began to change my heart. The text is one so familiar to most Christians that we may barely even give it a second thought. But 1 Corinthians 13 was a revelation to me. The heart of the teenager who had read all those romance novels still hungered for a deeper romance. All these years I had been looking for the perfect love, the love that would accept me, cherish me, complete me. It seemed at once impossible and healing to me, this love promised by God. I realized that I could not rise to these words by my own strength. When I first said yes to Jesus, I still considered many biblical assertions naive. The sophisticated tyranny in me could not swallow the idea of demons and angels and miracles. In short, such truths seemed too ridiculous to accept. One might as well believe in the tooth fairy. But Lewis salvaged these spiritual truths from the cloying hold of cultural misrepresentations. In Perelandra, he displayed angels as close to their biblical revelation as words can manage. I was captivated. These Eldilla I could believe in, for they were not ridiculous, dewy-looking cherubs. I began to pray that God would give his Eldilla charge over me. Lewis's fictional vocabulary was more real to me than the culturally defunct words that had lost their biblical meaning in the 20th century. Screwtape and his incompetent nephew Wormwood opened my mind to the fact that I had a real enemy. I began to ask God for protection from demonic influences, whereas before I had thought of my own sin as the only enemy. With the Chronicles of Narnia, my imagination awoke to the idea of a true heaven, and all my old beliefs about reincarnation simply fell away without a single argument. Lewis had managed to make eternal life so grippingly real that the fiction of reincarnation could not withstand the onslaught of the facts. C.S. Lewis didn't evangelize me, but he freed me to be a whole Christian, not one bound up by the lies of my old culture or the deceptions of my new one. Lewis made the worldview of Jesus real to me. I did not have to divorce my intellect from my faith, but merely to evangelize it. Associate minister at First Church of Christ, Wethersfield, Connecticut, Atessa Afshar is one of only a few Iranian-born women working in full-time Christian ministry. Her B.A. degree is in English and biology. She holds an M.Div. from Yale Divinity School.